Have you ever considered how the first transcontinental railroad transformed America, where it all started, and what remains in the modern day? Well, its impact was beyond significant, not only bringing in about the industrialization of the West, but also as a pillar on which the economic power of the United States was based. You see, without this rail line, the West may have never been settled to its full potential, not to mention the role it played during the first two world wars. The construction of the American Transcontinental Railroad was certainly one of the most ambitious human projects of the last few centuries. So join me in discovering its story. I'm your host Ryan Socash, and you're watching Its History. These days, catching a plane to California is not that big of a deal. You might be troubled by some long lines or minor delays. But before complaining, it might be humble of you to consider that in the past, you would have been required to cross the plains and mountains along the Platte River, only to later climb the Rocky Mountains. This was an incredible journey that took about an average of 6 months and frequently meant death by disease, ambush, and famine for thousands. Now, to be fair, you could also catch a steamship from New York, but that also had its challenges. You'd head down to the port of Chagres, Panama, and from there, by canoe, down the river of the same name, to Gorgona, where you would travel by mule or horse to Panama City, before a ship would sail up the west coast to San Francisco. Another 6 months or so for a very costly voyage reserved for the most ambitious and fit young men able to withstand malaria and tropical fevers from the jungle on their way. Finally, you could catch a ship in New York and travel 18,000 miles around South America to Cape Horn, a total of about 7 to 8 months at sea with all the risks of navigation. Hence, as long as trains existed, people were looking to set up a rail connection. In fact, something not everyone knows is that technically the first transcontinental rail line in the Americas was run by the Panama Railway for only 48 miles, linking the Pacific and the Atlantic Oceans back in 1855. This line fell into partial disuse after the opening of the canal in 1912, which allowed navigation between the two oceans, only to make a comeback in the 1910s when the saturation of traffic on the canal made it necessary to use the railway to supplement transport. Anyhow, Americans were looking for a better way to reach the other half of the country without the need to leave it. With that in mind, in 1862, the United States Congress passed the Pacific Railroad Act, ratified by the presidency of Abraham Lincoln over strong opposition, which provided for the construction of a railway line linking the West Coast to the existing railways on the Atlantic coast. The approval of the Omaha-Sacramento route represented a compromise between the many political and economic factors that had long divided public opinion at the time. The economic interests of the major railroad companies, the absence of Southern delegates in Congress due to the slavery issue, the creation of new states in the territory not yet under federal control through which the railroads would pass, and the military needs of the Civil War all influenced the choice of the route. The main proponent of a transcontinental railway was Asa Whitney, a New York merchant trading in China who was obsessed with the idea of a Pacific Railway. In January 1845, he petitioned Congress for a charter and granted a 60-mile strip of public land to help finance its construction. Whitney approved using the labor of Irish and German immigrants who were plentiful at the time. Wages were to be paid in land, ensuring the presence of settlers along the route who would supply products and become customers for the completed line. The failure of Congress to act on Whitney's proposal was largely due to the fierce opposition of Senator Thomas Hart Benton of Missouri, who favored a western route starting in St. Louis. In 1849, Whitney published a pamphlet promoting his project, entitled Project for a Railroad to the Pacific. Since 1845, several routes had been studied to connect the two oceans. The northern route from the Mississippi and Missouri rivers to the Columbia River, and the central route from St. Louis up the Kansas and Arkansas rivers to the Great Salt Lake, and then to California to reach San Francisco. Then there was the more complex route from Memphis through the Rocky Mountains to the Columbia River, Lewis up to Kansas and Arkansas rivers to the Great Salt Lake, and then to California to reach San Francisco. A more complicated route from Memphis through the Rocky Mountains near Santa Fe, and then across the Apache and Mohave Indian territories to Los Angeles. Or a southern route from New Orleans across Texas to San Diego. The latter was also the shortest and easiest option. Although Congress did not approve of his plan, Whitney made the Pacific Railroad one of the great public issues of the day. The acquisition of California after the Mexican War opened the way for other routes to the coast. The discovery of gold, the settlement of the frontier, and the success of the Eastern railroads increased interest in building a railroad to the Pacific. In March of 1853, Congress authorized a survey of the territories to be covered to determine whether such a route should be authorized. But in the end, the precarious political balance led to a change, and the central route was favored. The main problem with the central route was that it crossed areas that were still outside of government control and which were inhabited by war-prone Native Americans. So in January of 1853, an act was passed to create a new state in the territory of Nebraska and to provide facilities and incentives for settlers to move in during the project. The other hurdle to overcome was deciding whether the new territory would also allow slavery, a key issue in the winning votes of the Southern senators who had previously rejected similar attempts to regulate this so-called no man's land. Senator Stephen A. Douglas, an ardent supporter of the Central Route, won the votes of the Southern senators on the principle of popular sovereignty. It would be up to the new inhabitants to decide by referendum whether or not they wanted slavery. But Nebraska was north of the 36th, and therefore slavery would have been prohibited under the Missouri Compromise Act of 1820. With that in mind, Douglas's bill would have therefore implicitly repelled the measures of the far-off compromise, and the senators from Kentucky and Missouri insisted that the repeal be made explicit. President Jefferson Davis considered this possibility, but at this point, the confrontation shifted to the abolishment of slavery, and the railroad issue was sidelined. The debate continued bitterly for another 3 months until the decisive intervention of the new president, Franklin Pierce, led by the passage of the Nebraska Bill, and Nebraska, along with Kansas, became a new state in the Union on the 25th of May, 1854. And so it was. The pathway to the Central Railroad was opened. The construction of the Transcontinental Railway was entrusted by two large, newly formed companies, the Union Pacific and the Central Pacific. The two companies were to build two different routes, meeting at an unspecified point on the Central Route. The route would pass through California, Nevada, Omaha, Utah, Wyoming, and the newly formed state of Nebraska. The Union Pacific, founded in 1861, was to start the line from Omaha, while the Central Pacific route, founded in Sacramento in 1858, was to start laying track from the Californian city. The financing of such a massive undertaking could not be directly supported by the government, so the Pacific Railroad Act provided that in addition to a loan for each mile of track built, the two companies would be granted land in the uninhabited areas through which the line now passed. Congress decreed that the companies would receive $16,000 for each mile of line in flat land and $32,000 in hilly terrain, and then $48,000 for mountain lines. It was also stipulated that for every mile of railway built, the companies would be granted ownership of 20 square miles of land at the edge of the line. In other words, a strip of land that was 20 miles wide, allowing them to cross government land freely and without compensation. In this way, the companies came into possession of land that was worth nothing on paper, but would soon be sold for gold with the commercial opportunities offered by the proximity to the railway. The title of the original law in 1862, which laid down the basic criteria for the realization of the work, was titled An Act to Aid in the Construction of a Railroad and Telegraph Line from the Missouri River to the Pacific Ocean, and to secure to the government the use of the same for postal, military, and other purposes. The final act was not promulgated until 1863 and stated, quote, "An act to fix the gauge of the Pacific Railroad and its branches, be it enacted by the Senate and House of Representatives of the United States of America and Congress assembled, that the gauge of the Pacific Railroad and its branches throughout its entire extent from the Pacific coast to the Missouri River shall be, and at this moment is, 4 feet 8 1/2 inches. This act set the gauge to match that previously used by George Stephenson in England for the Liverpool and Manchester Rail of 1830, and was already popular with railways of the Northeast states. Thanks in part to the 1863 Act, this gauge would be widened, but not universally adopted in the United States, and is known as the standard gauge. You see, the choice of a common gauge made it easier to transfer wagons between different railroads and facilitated trackage rights between companies. Construction of the line was begun in 1863 by the Union Pacific, while work in California began 2 years later. The labor used by the railway companies was made up of workers from various nations, and at the end of hostilities, veterans of the Civil War. In particular, given the difficulties of both companies in recruiting workers for what was a risky, hard, and underpaid job, the Central Pacific exploited cheap Chinese labor, frequently referred to in a derogatory sense as coolies, also recruited directly in China. In addition to the Chinese, many Indian tribes, new Irish immigrants, Italians, Germans, and Poles worked on the Great American Railroad and helped defend the line. The technical difficulties faced by the companies were enormous. Crossing the Sierra Nevada required numerous tunnels and viaducts over ravines, with many casualties among the workers due to the lack of adequate safety measures and modern tools such as steam winches and mechanical excavators. The railway was built almost literally by hand. Construction progressed rapidly from Omaha westward, along the Mormon and Oregon trails, over the Rocky Mountains, and down into the Great Salt Lake Basin. At the same time, the Central Pacific crossed the Sierra and advanced along the Nevada valleys. Work on the two companies continued in record time, with 20,000 workers laying up to 8 miles of track a day in the final stages of the work. The reasons for this feverish track-laying race were not so much the will of the two companies to see who was more industrious in building the Great Railway, but rather the generous incentives in the form of government land offered by the government to those who managed to lay the most miles. On May the 10th, 1869, the two lines met at Promontory Point near Ogden, Utah. By the time the two sections joined, the Union Pacific had built 1,086 miles of railway, while the Central Pacific had only 689 miles, due to delays in starting construction and the enormous difficulties of crossing the mountains. Remember, before the full realization of this grandiose project, it took pioneers 4 to 6 months to reach California or Oregon from the Mississippi River, roughly halfway across the continent. And as we mentioned earlier, trade between the Atlantic and Pacific coasts of the young nation was mainly by sea, via Cape Horn, and even travelers with sufficient funds often chose this paradoxically safer route. But now, you could board a train at New York's 42nd Street station, and after 7 days and 6 nights traveling through Chicago and Omaha, get off in downtown Sacramento or San Francisco. In 1870, it took about 7 days and cost as little as $65 for a ticket on the Transcontinental line from New York to San Francisco, $136 for first class in a Pullman sleeping car, $110 for a second class, and as I previously mentioned, $65 for a seat in third or immigrant class. This was the first true transcontinental railroad, and the network was just beginning. Expansion came rapidly. New projects were soon developed that would employ thousands of people and further economic development of the U.S., meaning other transcontinental lines were built in the South, such as the South Pacific, Santa Fe. Others were expanding north along the U.S.-Canadian border, such as the Northern Pacific or the Great Northern, accelerating the colonization of the West by offering cheap farms and ranches on credit, transporting pioneers and supplies to the West in cattle, grain and minerals back to the east. Before the Transcontinental Railroad, railroads in general carried less than half as much freight as inland waterways, but by 1890, railroads carried 5 times as much freight as those same waterways, leading to further expansion. For example, on the 9th of August, 1893, the Atlantic and Pacific Railroad completed the line from AT&SF in Albuquerque, New Mexico, via Flagstaff, Arizona, to the Southern Pacific at Needless, California. The SP line at Barstow was leased by A&P in 1884 and purchased in 1911, giving AT&SF, AP's parent company, a direct route to Southern California. This line now forms the western part of the BNSF's Southern Transcon. In Colorado, the narrow gauge Denver and Rio Grande, otherwise known as DNRG, extended its line from Denver to Grand Junction via Pueblo in 1882. Then, in central Utah, the DNRG acquired several independent narrow gauge companies, which were consolidated into the first Denver and Rio Grande railroads. The tracks were also extended north to Salt Lake City, while lines were built south and east to Grand Junction. These lines were joined on March the 30th, 1883, and the extensions to Ogden, where it joined the Central Pacific, was completed on the 14th of May, 1883. The traffic between Denver and Ogden began just a few days later. However, there was an issue. You see, the broken gauge chain made direct interchange of rolling stock with standard gauge railways at the end of this bridge line impossible for several years. Hence, in 1887, the DNRG began rebuilding its main line, including a new track and tunnel at Tennessee Pass. From there, the first DNRGW was reincorporated as the Rio Grande Western in June of 1889, and gauge conversion began immediately. Standard gauge service between Ogden and Denver was completed on the 15th of November, 1890. The Northern Pacific Railway completed the 5th independent Transcontinental Railway on the 22nd of August, 1883, connecting Chicago with Seattle. The completion ceremony was held on the 8th of September, 1883, with former U.S. President Grant providing the final spike, but this was just the beginning. America would continue to aggressively expand. The California Southern Railroad was completed from National City on San Diego Bay through the Temecula Canyon to Colton and San Bernardino in September of 1883, and extended through the Cajon Pass to Barstow, a junction of the Atlantic and Pacific Railroads, in November of 1885. In September of 1885, the Southern Pacific Line from Colton to Los Angeles, a distance of 58 miles, was leased by the California Central with equal rights privileges, allowing the Santa Fe Transcontinental route to be completed with a connection to the California Southern and the A and PRR. The SP grade was used until the completion of the California Central line between San Bernardino and Los Angeles in June of 1887, a distance of 62.84 miles, which was part of the old Los Angeles and San Gabriel Valley Railroad that had been purchased. In August of 1888, the California Central completed its coast division southward from Los Angeles to the junction with the California Southern Railroad at Oceanside, a distance of 80.9 miles. These two divisions formed the main line of the California Central, and in conjunction with the California Southern, provided a direct link between Southern California and the East. This was also an era of rapid industrialization and technological innovation, bringing with it many advancements. Among the changes made to the railway were larger and more powerful locomotives, new types of freight cars, automatic couplers, the air brake, and the adoption of standard gauge by almost all railways, which critically allowed cars to be swapped between railroads. But then additionally, there was the creation of 4 standard time slots across the country, helping trains to keep their schedule. And then there was an increased use of steel rails and construction of bridges over major rivers. In other words, the progress was awe-inspiring. By 1916, there were at least 85,000 railroad stations in the United States. But there was a dark side. The Gilded Age, following the Civil War, was marked by widespread corruption, with robber barons reigning supreme. Conflict broke out between the major railways, and the larger lines took over the smaller ones. Between the Civil War and 1900, the Pennsylvania Railway took over more than 600 previously independent short lines. And there were many other issues. For example, rate discrimination and distorted service charges was also a major problem. Farmers and small businessmen in particular were vehement critics of the railroad rates. They felt that the railways gave preferential treatment and rates to larger shippers and discriminated against smaller shippers. In 1867, farmers organized the National Grange of the Patrons of Husbandry. As a result of pressure from farmers on state legislatures, some Midwestern states passed Granger laws, regulating railroad rates, and in 1887, the United States Interstate Commerce Commission was created to investigate rate structures. Labor also became a contentious issue during this period, and this growth coincided with the rise of trade unions in America. Before the First World War, the railways played a leading role and faced little competition from other forms of transportation, but now, major changes were on the horizon. For context, by 1916, railroads carried about 77% of all intercity freight and 98% of all intercity passenger traffic. Many Americans used trains for holiday travel, and the railways were active in promoting tourism. The rail network also reached an all-time high in terms of mileage. However, unfettered capitalism had come to an end, and the changes of the Progressive Era led to government regulation. After the First World War, the railways faced competition from river barges, Great Lake grain and ore ships, oil pipelines, aircraft, trucks, buses, and automobiles. During the post-World War I boom, many railways were forced out of business by competition from airlines and interstate highways. The rise of the automobile led to the end of passenger train service on most railways. Trucking companies had become major competitors in the 1930s with the advent of improved paved roads. And after the war, they expanded their operations as the interstate highway network grew, gaining an increasing share of the freight market along the way. The railways continued to carry bulk commodities such as coal, steel, and other raw materials. However, the ICC continued to regulate railroad rates and other aspects of railroad operations, limiting the railroad's flexibility to respond to changing market forces. As we've seen in countless other videos, with the rise of alternative logistics, rail lines fell out of use fast, leaving massive sections of the rails to be abandoned and forgotten. Don't worry, it's time to have a look at what remains. Over the decades, much of the railway has been modernized and rebuilt. However, it is still possible to find track sections, old locomotives, or stations from the late 19th and early 20th century in various parts of the United States. The most important site is undoubtedly Promontory Summit in Utah, where the Golden Spike ceremony took place on May 10th, 1869, when the tracks of the Union Pacific and the Central Pacific met to complete the line. The Golden Spike National Historic Park commemorates the event with a reconstruction of the original ceremony, exhibits, and original tracks. Visible remnants of the historic line are still easy to spot, and hundreds of miles are still in use today, mostly through the Sierra Nevada mountains and the canyons of Utah and Wyoming. Although the original rails have long since been replaced due to age and wear, and the ballast line has been upgraded and repaired as well, the lines generally run on the original handmade path. Overlooks on Interstate 80 through California's Truckee Canyon offers panoramic views for many miles of the original Central Pacific line and the snow canopies that made winter travel safe and practical. On the 10th of May, 2006, the anniversary of the spike driving, Utah announced that its quarter design would depict the driving of the final spike. In areas where the original route has been bypassed and abandoned, mainly by the Lucent Cutoff route in Utah, the original grade of the road is still evident, as are many cuts and fills, particularly the Big Fill a few miles east of Promontory. The wide curve that connected the eastern end of the Big Fill now passes the Thiokol Rocket Research and Development Facility. In 1957, Congress established the Golden Spike National Historic Site, which was renamed Golden Spike National Historic Park in 2019. Today, the site houses replicas of the engines of the Union Pacific No. 119 and the Central Pacific's Jupiter. The National Park Service periodically lights the engines for public demonstrations. I should also point out that there are several places where you can see original sections or structures from the late 1800s and early 1900s. For example, in the Donner Pass area of California, you can see some tunnels such as the 1,659-foot Summit Tunnel, which took more than 15 months to excavate. Most of the workers for this section were Chinese, who toiled with hand drills and risked their lives with black powder, or the then newly invented nitroglycerin. A vertical shaft was sunk to allow construction in both directions, away from the tunnel center. The tunnel was completed in 1867, almost a year before the first train passed through. The Summit Tunnel was replaced by the longer Mount Judah Tunnel in 1925. The tracks over the highest part of the line have been removed. Another section of the line can be seen between the small towns of Colfax and Baxter. Near Donner Pass, Truckee Station is a great place to watch the trains come and go. The current station was built in 1900. It shares space with the Chamber of Commerce and the Visitor Center. Other areas are in Old Sacramento, California, where one of two segments of the Central Pacific Railroad is preserved. The California State Railroad Museum displays locomotives, rolling stock, and historical artifacts, and provides in-depth information about California's railroad history, and importantly for the sake of this video, the Transcontinental Railroad. In Cheyenne, Wyoming, the Depot Museum displays the history of the Union Pacific Railroad and provides an overview of its involvement in the construction of the Transcontinental Railroad. The town also has a historic train depot and a preserved roundhouse. In Ogden, Utah, the Union Station Museum houses an extensive collection of historic railroad artifacts and information about the history of the Union Pacific. In Council Bluffs, Iowa, a town with ties to the Union Pacific and a key role in the construction force, there is the Rails West Railroad Museum, which offers an insight into the railroad history of the area, as well as the Transcontinental Line. Finally, Fort Sedgwick Museum in Julesburg, Colorado, also features historical artifacts related to the railroad and the history of the area during the construction of the Transcontinental Line. But with all that being said, I'd argue that the biggest remnant of the Transcontinental Railroad is the population of America's West. And we'll leave it there for today, but thank you all for watching, and until next time, I'm Ryan Socash, signing off.